The small town hall buzzed with chatter that evening. The crowd had filled every seat, waiting for the local talent show to begin. People laughed, shared snacks, and whispered about who might win this year. The stage lights glowed softly and a piano stood at the center, polished but old, its keys worn from years of use. The host walked onto the stage with a wide smile, holding a microphone, his voice echoing through the hall as he introduced the first few performers. Each person had their moment. Singers, dancers, a magician who made coins vanish, and even a boy who tried to juggle apples but dropped one to everyone's amusement. The audience clapped and laughed. The mood was light and playful. Then, after a short break, the host looked down at his paper and called the next name. A quiet hush spread across the room when a young woman stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, and her shoes clicked softly against the wooden floor. She didn't walk with confidence like the others had. Instead, her steps were careful, almost hesitant. Some people tilted their heads, curious. Others leaned toward their friends and whispered things that made them smile. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment. The stage light seemed brighter now, almost blinding. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress with her trembling hands, and then sat down on the small, uneven stool. It creaked loudly under her weight, and a few people in the front row chuckled. She heard it. Of course she did. Every small sound on that stage reached her ears like an echo. Her cheeks turned slightly red, but she kept her eyes on the piano keys. She placed her fingers gently over them, then stopped again. It wasn't time yet. The host gave her a nod from the side, and she tried to return a nervous smile. Someone in the back whispered, "I bet she's not that good." Another voice replied, "Yeah, she looks scared to death." A small wave of quiet laughter rippled through the seats. She didn't look up. She'd been through this before. The stares, the smirks, the way people looked at her and already decided she wasn't worth listening to. Every time she tried to perform somewhere, it was the same story. She wasn't from a rich family. She didn't have fancy clothes or a music teacher who guided her. She had taught herself, and that to many people seemed unbelievable. As she sat there, her heart raced faster. She thought of all the nights she had practiced alone in her small room, the old second-hand piano pushed against a cracked wall. The keys were chipped, some barely produced sound anymore, but she still played. She remembered sitting for hours, her fingers aching, repeating the same tune until it finally sounded right. Her neighbors had sometimes complained about the noise late at night. Her mother used to tell her to sleep early because she had to wake up for work the next morning, but she couldn't help it. Music was the only thing that made her feel alive. It was her escape from the long, tiring days of working at the bakery where she spent hours kneading dough and serving customers who barely noticed her. Now, sitting under the bright lights, she wondered if all those nights of practice meant anything. Maybe the crowd was right. Maybe she wasn't good enough. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. She had come here to show what she loved most, not to be mocked again. The hall was quiet now. The laughter had faded. Only the soft hum of the lights and the sound of her own breathing filled her ears. She took another deep breath, closed her eyes, and finally pressed the first key. A faint note echoed through the hall, shaky, uncertain, followed by another and another. The melody hadn't formed yet. It was just small fragments of sound, like she was testing the air. Some people shifted in their seats, already looking bored. A few looked toward the exit as if deciding whether to stay, but she kept going. Slowly, the notes began to find each other. Her hands started to move more smoothly. Her body relaxed as she leaned slightly forward, letting the music guide her. She no longer heard the crowd or felt their judgment. For her, it was just her and the piano again, like all those nights at home. The sound started to grow, filling the room with gentle warmth. The melody began to take shape, soft, emotional, yet full of strength. Her fingers danced over the keys, finding rhythm and flow. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every note carried a piece of her story. For a moment, the people in the audience stopped whispering. Something about the way she played made them pay attention. It wasn't technical brilliance or professional showmanship. It was something deeper. The music seemed to tell a story, one they couldn't quite explain. A man in the second row frowned, leaning forward slightly. A young girl in the front rested her chin on her hands, listening closely. Even the host standing to the side of the stage seemed to forget his cue cards. The performer's eyes were closed now. Her fingers moved faster, not from nerves, but from passion. The sound of the piano grew stronger, richer. Every key she touched seemed to carry emotion, longing, sadness, hope, and joy all mixed together. It wasn't the kind of music that made people tap their feet. It was the kind that made them feel something they hadn't expected. But the journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Only a few months earlier, she had almost given up. Her father had fallen sick and the family's small savings were spent on medicine. She took extra shifts at the bakery to help, often returning home too tired to even eat dinner. Some nights she would fall asleep sitting at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys. Her friends told her to stop wasting her time with music. "You need to be realistic," they said. "You'll never get anywhere with that old piano." But she couldn't listen. Deep down, she believed that one day someone would hear her play and understand. That belief was what brought her here tonight. Even though she knew people would judge her, she came anyway. She didn't dress up. She didn't bring anyone to cheer for her. She just wanted a chance. One moment to show her truth. As her fingers moved through the melody, memories flashed through her mind. The night she first touched a piano at the local church, the kind old janitor who let her stay after hours to practice, the feeling of being completely alone yet somehow full of purpose. Her music reflected all of that, the hardship, the quiet strength, and the hope she never stopped holding on to. The crowd was changing. The mocking expressions had disappeared. People who had laughed minutes earlier were now silent, watching closely. Some looked surprised. Others seemed moved without knowing why. The melody filled every corner of the room. She didn't notice any of it. Her world had shrunk to the size of the piano keys beneath her hands. She wasn't thinking about winning or impressing anyone. She was simply telling her story the only way she knew how, through music. The soft notes turned powerful, echoing through the hall like waves. Then as the piece neared its end, her hand slowed down. The last few notes lingered in the air, sweet and heavy with emotion. When the final sound faded, she opened her eyes and looked at the audience. There was complete silence. For a few seconds, nobody moved. She could hear her own heartbeat. Her stomach tightened. Maybe they didn't like it, she thought. Maybe she had failed again. Then someone in the back started to clap. Once, then twice. A second later, the entire hall burst into applause. People stood from their seats cheering loudly. Some even whistled. She froze for a moment, unable to believe it. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood slowly and gave a small bow. The same people who had laughed at her earlier were now smiling, some wiping their eyes. The applause continued, echoing around her like thunder. She stepped away from the piano and walked off stage, her heart still pounding, her hands shaking. Not from fear this time, but from disbelief and joy. Backstage, the host gave her a thumbs up, his eyes wide with admiration. "That was beautiful," he said softly. She smiled faintly, still too overwhelmed to speak. She sat down on a small bench, closed her eyes, and listened to the fading applause. In that moment, she realized something important. She hadn't just played a song. She had shared her soul with people who had never expected to feel anything from her music. And though she didn't know what would happen next, she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The sound of the applause still echoed in her ears long after she left the stage. She walked slowly toward the narrow corridor behind the curtain, her hands trembling as she held them together. Her heart was still racing, not from fear now, but from something new, a mix of relief and disbelief. She had done it. She had faced them all, the stares, the whispers, the laughter, and somehow she had turned it all around. Backstage, a few other contestants stood waiting for their turns. Some smiled at her, offering quick nods of respect, while others simply looked away, unsure what to say. One of the stage crew, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, approached her quietly and said, "That was beautiful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His voice was calm and sincere, and it made her eyes sting again. She managed a small smile and whispered a thank you before he went back to his work. She sat down on a wooden bench near the corner of the stage, her old shoes tapping softly on the floor. Her fingers were still shaking slightly, and she stared at them in silence. They looked tired, thin, pale, the nails slightly chipped, but to her they were proof of every late night, every small step she had taken to get here. She rubbed them gently, feeling the faint ache from the long performance. Outside, she could still hear the host calling the next performer's name. The sound of a violin filled the hall now, sharp and elegant. The audience clapped politely, but their energy felt different, like something inside them had shifted after her performance. For a moment, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to breathe deeply. The smell of the stage, the faint scent of dust and old wood, mixed with the warmth of the lights, surrounded her. It didn't feel real. A few hours ago, she had been at the bakery, finishing her shift covered in flour and sugar. She had gone home, quickly changed into her simple dress, and come here hoping only that she wouldn't embarrass herself. She never expected applause. She never expected anyone to care. When the show ended later that night, she stayed in the hall's corner, waiting for the crowd to clear before leaving. People were still talking about her. She heard snippets of their conversations as they passed. Who was that girl? That song gave me chills. I didn't think she'd be that good. Each word felt like a soft wave washing over her heart. For years, she had been invisible. Now, for the first time, people saw her, not as the quiet girl from the bakery, but as someone who had something real to offer. She stepped out into the cool night air. The sky was clear and the faint smell of rain lingered in the breeze. She walked home slowly, her small bag slung over her shoulder, her shoes clicking against the pavement. The streets were quiet. Most shops were closed, and only a few lights glowed through windows. Her neighborhood wasn't much. Narrow streets, small houses lined close together, old street lamps that flickered at times. But tonight everything seemed softer, almost magical. She looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. When she reached home, the lights were still on. Her mother was waiting at the table, a cup of tea in her hands. The woman looked up as she entered and immediately stood, her eyes filled with curiosity. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice calm but eager. She took off her shoes and walked closer, trying not to grin too wide. "It went well," she said softly. They clapped. Her mother raised her eyebrows. "Clapped? How much?" She laughed gently. "A lot. They even stood up." Her mother covered her mouth in surprise. "You're joking." She shook her head, smiling as tears filled her eyes. "No, I'm not. They really did." For a moment, her mother just looked at her, her face a mix of pride and disbelief. Then she stepped forward and hugged her tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "I knew you would." They stood like that for a while, two women in a small, dimly lit kitchen, holding each other quietly while the world outside slept. That night, when she finally went to bed, she couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every moment. The laughter before she started, the silence during the song, the sound of clapping afterward. It felt like a dream she didn't want to wake from. She turned to the side, looking at the old piano by the window. Its paint was chipped, one of the legs slightly wobbly, but to her it looked beautiful. She whispered softly to it, "We did it." The next morning, she went to work as usual. The bakery smelled of fresh bread and coffee, the same as always. But something in the air felt different. Her co-workers looked at her strangely, some curious, some smiling. Around midday, a customer came in, holding a small newspaper folded in his hand. He pointed at the front page where her picture was printed, a small photo taken during her performance, her hands frozen mid-air above the piano keys. The headline read, "Unknown girl moves crowd to tears with her performance." Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected that. The customer smiled and said, "You're famous now." She blushed, shaking her head. "No, I'm not," but people started to talk more. Customers mentioned seeing her on stage, and some even asked if she would play again. Her boss, a plump man with a gentle voice, came out from the back and said, "You made us proud. I didn't know we had a real artist working here." She laughed shyly, unsure how to respond. Fame wasn't what she wanted. All she ever dreamed of was to share her music, to make people feel what she felt when she played. A few days later, she received a call from someone she didn't know. The voice on the other end introduced himself as one of the judges from the talent show. He told her that a local music academy had heard about her performance and wanted her to audition for a scholarship program. She was silent for a few seconds, trying to process what she had just heard. "Me? A scholarship?" she asked in disbelief. "Yes," he replied warmly. They were very impressed. "You have something special, something that can't be taught." When she hung up the phone, her hands were shaking again. She turned to her mother, who was standing nearby with a questioning look. "They want me to audition," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Her mother's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "You have to go," she said immediately. "You can't miss this chance," and she did go. The following week, she walked into the academy's large building, her simple dress standing out among the students in crisp uniforms. The grand hall smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers, and the sound of pianos echoed faintly through the corridors. She felt small again, just like that first night on stage. But when she sat at the piano in the audition room, the same calmness returned. The judges watched her silently from behind their table, pens in hand. She took a deep breath and began to play. This time she didn't think about fear or failure. She thought about her little house, her mother, the bakery, the people who had doubted her, and the way the audience had looked at her that night when they finally saw her for who she was. Her fingers moved with quiet strength, each note clear and full of life. When she finished, there was a brief silence. One of the judges smiled softly and said, "You have a gift." Another nodded. "It's not about technique," he said. "It's about feeling. You play with heart." She left the room unsure if that meant she had passed, but she didn't care. She had given them her best. A few days later, a letter arrived at her home. It was simple, white paper, black ink, but it carried the message she had dreamed of hearing. She had been accepted. She had earned the scholarship. Her mother cried when she read it. She herself just sat quietly, holding the letter close to her chest, unable to believe it was real. That night she went to the piano again. She touched the keys softly, her fingers tracing the familiar pattern. She played the same tune she had performed at the show, only this time slower, gentler. She smiled through tears, knowing this was just the beginning of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The girl who once played in the shadows, laughed at and ignored, was now stepping into a world where her music would finally be heard. The academy was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. Tall ceilings, polished floors, and halls lined with grand pianos and music stands filled the space. She walked through it slowly, her fingers brushing the smooth wooden railing along the staircase. Every corner smelled faintly of varnish and sheet music, a scent that made her heart race with excitement and nerves. She had never been in a place like this before. On her first day, she met other students, some dressed neatly in uniforms, some carrying expensive instruments. They all seemed confident and practiced, speaking about composers she had only read about in books at the library. She felt out of place at first, as though she didn't belong. She remembered the small apartment she shared with her mother, the hours spent in the bakery, and the tiny piano at home with keys that stuck and notes that sometimes refused to play. Compared to this, the academy felt like another world. Her instructor, a gentle woman with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes, welcomed her warmly. "You have a rare gift," she said softly, "but talent alone is not enough. Here, you will learn discipline, expression, and the strength to bring your music to life." The first few days were overwhelming. The schedule was intense. Early morning exercises, theory classes, technique drills, and long hours of practice. At first, she struggled. Her fingers were not used to the smooth, heavy keys of the academy pianos. Some of the other students practiced pieces that seemed impossibly complex, moving their hands with a confidence she had never known. A few of them glanced at her with quiet judgment, noticing her simple dress, her unpolished shoes, and the way she paused sometimes to think before playing. She reminded herself of the talent show, of the night when the audience had clapped and stood for her. That memory gave her courage. She practiced longer than anyone else, often staying after hours in the practice rooms, her fingers growing stronger and more confident with each note. She would play until the sound of the hall echoed in her ears, until her fingers ached and her heart was full. One evening, she overheard a conversation between two students in the hall. "Did you hear her play the first day? I didn't think she would last a week," one said with a small laugh. The other shrugged. "She's improving fast, but she's still different. She doesn't have the polish that the rest of us do." She stopped in her tracks, her chest tightening. The words hurt, but not as much as they could have. She realized she didn't need to be like everyone else. Her strength was in her own story, her own way of expressing herself. That thought gave her determination. In the days that followed, she focused on learning everything she could. Her instructor noticed her dedication. "You have heart," she said one afternoon. "Talent can be taught. Heart cannot." She spent hours at the piano, playing pieces she had only dreamed of performing. She learned to read new music, to follow rhythms and dynamics, to let her emotions flow naturally. Slowly, her confidence grew. She even began to notice small changes in the other students. Some smiled when she entered the room, offering nods of encouragement instead of judgment. A few began asking her about her techniques and the pieces she played. One day, a senior student approached her during a break. "I heard you play in the local talent show," he said. "You moved the whole crowd. I didn't expect it. You have a gift." She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm still learning. There's a lot I don't know." "You'll learn fast," he replied. "Just keep at it. You're different in a good way. People will notice." It wasn't long before the academy announced a small recital for the students. Everyone was to perform in front of the instructors and their peers, playing a piece that represented their journey. She felt nervous, more nervous than she had at the talent show, because this was a place filled with musicians who had trained their whole lives. But she remembered the night when she had played on the stage and the audience had felt her story. That memory gave her courage. The night of the recital arrived. The hall was smaller than the main auditorium at the talent show, but it was elegant and full of expectant faces. She sat at the piano taking a deep breath. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and for a moment time seemed to slow. She closed her eyes and remembered every small practice, every night of exhaustion, every moment she had dreamed of this. Then she pressed the first key. The sound filled the room softly at first, almost fragile. Then it grew, stronger and more confident. Her music told a story of struggle, hope, and quiet perseverance. Her fingers danced over the keys, moving faster, more freely, each note carrying her emotions. Some students leaned forward in their seats, surprised by the depth and feeling of her playing. Even the instructors watched intently, taking notes but unable to hide the admiration in their eyes. When the final note faded, the hall was silent for a heartbeat. Then applause filled the room, gentle at first, then louder. Her heart raced and she stood slowly, bowing. Some students clapped and smiled, others whispered to each other in surprise. She felt a quiet pride, not because she had been praised, but because she had shared herself completely through music. After the recital, one of her instructors pulled her aside. "You have the ability to make people feel something profound," she said. "But remember, talent is not just about skill. It is about honesty. Never lose that honesty." Those words stayed with her. She realized that music was more than notes and practice. It was about conveying feelings, telling stories without words, connecting with people in a way that only music could. In the weeks that followed, she grew more confident. Her skills improved rapidly. She started performing in small gatherings organized by the academy, for parents, visitors, and sometimes for local events. Each time, she felt the same mix of nerves and excitement, but she also felt a quiet strength. She knew that the music inside her could reach people if she let it. One rainy afternoon, as she walked through the campus courtyard between classes, she noticed a small group of children huddled under a tree, trying to stay dry. They were looking at an old, broken piano that someone had left near the side of a building. Without thinking, she walked over, lifted the lid, and began to play. The sound was rough at first, keys sticking, notes uneven, but the children's faces lit up. They listened quietly, entranced by the melody. By the time she finished, they were clapping and cheering. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. This was what she had always wanted, to share music, not for fame, not for recognition, but to touch someone else's heart. The experience reminded her of her own journey. She had once been a quiet girl in a small town, laughed at and doubted, practicing on an old piano in the corner of her tiny room. Now she could inspire others. She could show them that music was not about privilege or perfection. It was about passion, perseverance, and honesty. Her time at the academy continued, and with each passing day, she learned more than just music. She learned patience, discipline, and how to face challenges head-on. There were moments of frustration, when a piece felt impossible, when her fingers wouldn't move the way she wanted, or when a performance didn't go as planned. But each time she reminded herself why she was there. Music was her voice. Music was her way of telling the world who she was. And slowly she began to believe that the world would listen. One evening, as she left the academy after a long day of practice, she looked up at the sky. The sunset painted the clouds in shades of orange and pink. She smiled, thinking of the night she had first played in front of that small-town crowd. The laughter, the surprise, the applause. It all seemed so far away, yet it had shaped her. It had given her courage. She realized that her journey was just beginning. There were still many stages to play on, many people to reach, and countless stories to tell through her music. But for the first time, she felt ready. Not because she was perfect, not because she had all the answers, but because she had her heart, her music, and her determination to keep going. And with that she walked home slowly, the soft sound of rain tapping on the pavement, carrying with her the quiet promise that she would never stop sharing her music with the world. The day of the citywide music competition arrived faster than she had expected. It was a large auditorium, unlike the small hall in her town. The stage was high, the lights bright, and the audience stretched far back into shadowed rows. She stepped off the elevator with her small bag slung over her shoulder, taking in the bustling backstage area. Contestants were everywhere, warming up on pianos, tuning violins, or whispering last-minute encouragements to each other. Some wore glittering dresses, some had expensive instruments that gleamed under the stage lights. She felt a familiar flutter of nerves. For a moment, she wanted to turn around and go home, to hide from the judgment of strangers whose lives seemed so different from hers. But she remembered the first night at the talent show, the laughter, the silence, the applause, and the quiet power of simply playing from the heart. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that her music wasn't about appearances. It was about truth. The host called her name, and she walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her, warm and blinding, but this time she didn't shrink back. She adjusted the piano bench, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes for a moment. The audience murmured, and a few people whispered to each other, their expressions skeptical. They didn't know her yet. They didn't know the story she carried in her fingers. Then she pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, and the audience leaned forward slightly. She began to play a melody she had composed herself, one that told the story of quiet struggle, of dreams nurtured in the smallest of rooms, of nights spent practicing while the world slept. The music flowed slowly at first, gentle but full of emotion, and the audience began to quiet down. The whispers faded. Even the judges leaned forward, curious about the girl whose presence seemed so unassuming. As she continued, the melody grew stronger. Her fingers moved faster, more confidently, each note precise yet full of feeling. She poured everything into the music, her past struggles, her hope, her quiet victories. The audience could feel it. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others sat rigid, stunned by the intensity of emotion carried through every note. A young man in the front row whispered to the woman next to him, "She's amazing." The woman nodded silently, her eyes wide with disbelief. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered in judgment. The sound of the piano filled every corner of the auditorium, wrapping around the audience like a story being told without words. The girl didn't notice the audience. She didn't notice the judges, the lights, or the cameras capturing her performance. She only felt the keys beneath her fingers, the rhythm of the music and the story she was telling. It was as if time had slowed, and for those few minutes, there was only her and the piano. She played a section that was fast, almost frenzied, yet precise. Her fingers flew across the keys, creating a storm of sound that was both powerful and delicate. She remembered the nights of practice when her fingers ached so badly, she thought they would never move again. She thought of the old piano at home, the one with the chipped keys, and smiled through the intensity. Every note she played now was a tribute to those nights, to the perseverance that had brought her here. The audience was silent, captivated. Even those who had arrived expecting a simple performance found themselves leaning forward, caught in the music. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others held their breath, afraid to break the spell. She had never imagined that a single performance could move so many people, yet here it was happening. As the piece reached its climax, the sound swelled. Her hands moved with precision and grace, striking chords that seemed almost impossible. The music told a story of struggle giving way to triumph, of doubt being replaced by confidence, of a quiet heart standing tall in the face of the world. Each note was a reflection of her journey, every chord a testament to the nights she had spent alone with her piano. Then, in the final moments, the music softened. She played a simple, delicate melody that seemed to hang in the air, each note echoing in the silence of the auditorium. The last key lingered, fading slowly, and she held her breath, waiting. For a moment there was nothing. The audience was still. And then, as if waking from a dream, the applause began. A single clap at first, then more, until the entire auditorium was filled with the sound of hands striking together. People stood cheering, whistling, and shouting. Some were crying, their hands covering their mouths in disbelief. The girl, overwhelmed, leaned forward and bowed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The judges were on their feet, clapping louder than anyone else. One of them shouted, "Extraordinary! Simply extraordinary." Another nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. The applause went on, echoing through the hall, filling every corner with the sound of amazement. Backstage, the host was smiling broadly. "Did you see that?" he said to the crew. She just left them speechless. The girl stepped away from the piano, her hands still shaking. She had expected nerves, maybe even disappointment, but not this. The audience had responded not to perfection, not to flashy techniques, but to her honesty. They had felt her journey, her story, her heart. When she left the stage, people came up to her, some shaking her hand, others offering words of admiration. "That was incredible," one man said. "I've never felt anything like it." A young woman hugged her tightly, whispering, "Thank you. Your music. It touched me." Her mother, who had come for the event, rushed to her side. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced her daughter. "I knew it," she said softly. "I knew you would move them." The girl smiled through her tears. She had done more than perform. She had shown that music could reach hearts in ways words never could. She had shown that determination, passion, and honesty could break through doubt, fear, and mockery. The next day, the story spread. Local news stations ran short clips of her performance. People shared videos online, amazed by the depth of emotion in her playing. Messages poured in from strangers, thanking her for sharing her gift, telling her that she had inspired them to follow their own dreams. For the girl, this was overwhelming but beautiful. She had never sought recognition or fame. She had only wanted to play, to share the music that lived inside her. Yet now she saw how far that simple act could reach. People she had never met felt her story, felt her struggle, felt her triumph. Even weeks later, she would think back to that night and feel her heart swell. The auditorium, the lights, the audience, and it was all etched in her memory. A reminder of what was possible when someone dared to share their truth. Her journey at the academy continued, but the citywide performance had changed her. She no longer doubted herself in the way she once had. She had faced an audience that had once been skeptical, and she had left them in awe. She had discovered the power of honesty in music and the way it could connect people, and yet she remained humble. She continued practicing late into the night, still learning, still growing. She still remembered the little piano at home, the quiet nights of practice, and the small victories that had brought her this far. Those memories grounded her, reminding her that talent alone was not enough. Heart, persistence, and honesty were what made music truly meaningful. When she returned to her small apartment, she sat at her piano and played quietly, a simple melody for herself, away from the applause and the bright lights. She played for the nights she had spent alone, for the mornings she had risen early to work, for the obstacles she had overcome. She played for her mother, for the people who had doubted her, and for every listener who might hear her in the future. And as she played, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. She knew that no matter where life took her next, her music would always be her voice. It would always be the way she could reach hearts, inspire courage, and bring beauty into the world. That night, she fell asleep with a quiet smile, knowing that she had changed something inside herself, and maybe inside everyone who had heard her play. She had learned the true power of music, It was not just sound but emotion, story, and heart. And through it, she had found her place in the world. After the citywide performance, her life began to change in ways she had never imagined. People remembered her. Teachers at the academy praised her consistently, not just for her skill but for her dedication and the honesty she brought to her music. Fellow students who had once looked at her with quiet judgment now approached her for advice, for tips, and even just for the quiet courage that seemed to radiate from her. One morning, a letter arrived in the mail from a renowned music festival. They had seen a recording of her performance and wanted to invite her to play in their upcoming event. She held the envelope with shaking hands, feeling both excitement and disbelief. Playing at a festival of that scale was something she had never dared to dream of. It was an opportunity reserved for professional musicians, for those with years of training and prestige. And yet here it was, an invitation. Her mother sat beside her as she read the letter aloud, tears welling up in her eyes. "They want you to perform?" she whispered. "Yes," she said softly. "They actually want me." Her mother held her close, and for a long moment neither spoke. The weight of everything they had been through, the struggles, the long nights of practice, the fear of failure, pressed down on them both, and then lifted in the warmth of this new possibility. The weeks leading up to the festival were intense. She practiced every day, refining her pieces, experimenting with new melodies, and learning to express her emotions more clearly through music. She faced moments of doubt, times when she felt her hands would never move the way she wanted or that her melodies weren't strong enough. But each time she remembered the first night she had performed in the small town hall, the applause that had changed her life, and the feeling of connection that music had given her. When the day of the festival arrived, the hall was massive. The stage was surrounded by lights that glowed like stars, and the audience seemed endless, stretching far back into the shadows. She felt a familiar flutter of nerves, but also a quiet determination. This was not just about winning or recognition. It was about sharing her story, touching people with her music, and honoring the journey that had brought her here. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The piano was grand, gleaming under the lights. She approached it carefully, as if greeting an old friend. When she sat down, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories of her journey wash over her. The bakery, the small piano at home, the talent show, the academy, and every late night of practice in between. Then, with calm resolve, she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, and filled with emotion. The audience fell silent, captivated by the sincerity in every sound. Her music told the story of her life, the struggles, the doubts, the quiet moments of perseverance, and the triumphs that had come through dedication and heart. She played as she had always played, not for perfection, not for approval, but for truth. As the piece grew, so did the intensity. Her fingers moved quickly, gracefully, painting a vivid picture of emotions across the keys. Every note was precise yet full of feeling. The audience could feel her journey, feel the nights she had spent alone with her piano, the exhaustion of hard work, the hope that had never faded. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others leaned forward in awe, unable to look away. In the middle of the performance, she played a part that was fast and dramatic, a storm of sound that demanded attention. Her fingers moved with confidence and passion, telling a story that words could never express. She remembered moments of doubt, moments when people had laughed or turned away, and she channeled that into every note. The music was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been overlooked, doubted, or told they couldn't achieve their dreams. The audience was completely silent, every ear attuned to the piano. Even the judges, seasoned professionals, sat still, absorbed by the depth and power of the music. By the time she reached the final notes, her hands had become almost an extension of her heart, speaking a language that only music could convey. The last chord lingered in the air, soft but full of resonance, before fading into complete silence. Then the hall erupted. Applause, cheers, and whistles filled the space. People stood clapping and shouting, moved by the honesty and passion of her performance. Some were crying, touched beyond words. She bowed, overwhelmed, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. She had done it again. She had turned doubt and skepticism into awe and admiration. Backstage, the staff and other performers congratulated her. They had heard the applause from the audience and were visibly moved. The host of the festival came up to her, his eyes shining. "You have done something incredible," he said. The audience has never been so captivated. Her mother, who had traveled with her, embraced her tightly. "You've made it truly," she whispered. "Every note, every effort, every moment of perseverance, and it all brought you here." For the next few weeks, the news of her performance spread far and wide. Videos circulated online, articles were written, and people from different cities and countries reached out to share how her music had touched them. She had never imagined that her quiet, honest playing could reach so many hearts, and yet here it was. Proof that authenticity and dedication could break barriers. Even with all this recognition, she remained humble. She continued her studies at the academy, learning more about music, experimenting with new styles, and teaching herself to express increasingly complex emotions. She helped younger students, encouraging them to find their own voices and reminding them that talent could blossom anywhere. Regardless of background or circumstance, one evening, after a long day of practice, she returned to her small apartment. Her piano sat quietly in the corner, familiar and comforting. She sat down and began to play, not for an audience, not for applause, but for herself. She played the melodies she had composed, the ones she had performed at the festival, and some new ones she had created in the quiet of her room. The music was soft, reflective, full of the emotions she carried inside her. She realized that all the recognition, all the applause, all the invitations and letters, and they were wonderful, but they were not the reason she played. She played because music was her voice, her way of telling the world who she was and what she felt. It was her way of connecting, inspiring, and healing both herself and others. Time passed, and she began to perform more frequently, at concerts, festivals, and events. She became known not just for her technical skill, but for the honesty and emotion she brought to every performance. People came to see her not because she was famous, but because they knew her music could move them in ways words could not. Despite the success, she remained grounded. She visited her old neighborhood, played at small local events, and continued teaching young children who reminded her of herself. She shared her story openly, telling them that talent could come from anywhere. That hard work, persistence, and honesty were just as important as any technique. Through it all, she never forgot the first audience that had laughed at her, nor the small piano at home, nor the long nights of practice. Those moments had shaped her, given her resilience, and taught her that the heart behind the music mattered more than any stage, any hall, or any applause. One night, after returning from a concert in a distant city, she looked out of her apartment window at the quiet streets below, the lights of the town reflected in the dark sky, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come far, yet she remained the same person at her core, the girl who had once faced laughter and doubt, the girl who had never stopped believing in her music. Her mother sat beside her, smiling softly. "You've done more than you imagined," she said. "I just played," she replied, her eyes bright with emotion. "I just shared my music." "But you've changed people," her mother said. "You've given them hope, inspiration, and a reminder that even the quietest voice can be heard." She nodded, understanding now that her journey had never been just about her. It had been about everyone who had felt unseen, unheard, or doubted. Through her music, she had shown that courage, dedication, and honesty could break barriers, touch hearts, and create change. Years later, when she reflected on that journey, from the small town hall to the grand stages of the festival and beyond, she understood that every challenge, every late night of practice, every moment of doubt had been worth it. She had learned that the power of music was not in fame, wealth, or recognition, but in its ability to connect people, to tell stories, and to inspire hearts, and so she continued to play, never losing sight of the reason she had started. Every note was a story, every melody a reflection of her journey, every performance a chance to touch the world. The crowd that had once mocked her was now only a memory, replaced by audiences who listened, felt, and believed in the music she shared. Her life was no longer about proving herself to others. It was about living her passion fully, embracing the music that had always been inside her, and reminding everyone, and including herself, that a quiet heart can have a powerful voice, and that anyone who dares to follow their dreams can leave a lasting mark on the world. Through music, she had discovered not just her own strength, but the power to inspire, heal, and move others in ways words could never achieve. And that, she knew, was the greatest triumph of all.